I would like to introduce today's presenters. Abhikesh Singh leads the cloud transformation research for Everest Group. As a partner with the firm, Abhishek is responsible for growth, client relationships, and thought leadership in North America. Mukesh Ranjan is a vice president in the information technology services team at Everest Group. In his role, he leads research in the areas of enterprise digital transformation, cloud and traditional infrastructure, next generation network infrastructure, digital workplace, and cybersecurity. Zach Charel is a member of the Information Technology Services team and is a practice director in the Cloud and Infrastructure Service, CIS, research practice. In his role, he's responsible for shaping and leading the publication research program focused on domains such as public cloud, private cloud, data center, mainframe, and cloud security. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Abhishek.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to kind of kick off the discussion today. And in many ways, isn't this the $1 million or the $1 billion question, which is the question of, hey, how are enterprises supposed to realize value from their cloud journeys? Now, hold on for a moment. So before we even jump into the question of the significance of value in cloud, I think one thing that I would like to spend a few seconds on is just understanding what do enterprises really mean when they say they want to realize value from cloud. Is it about the cost of cloud? Is it about the talent that is available? Is it about speed of innovation that enterprises had envisaged when they embarked on these different journeys focused on cloud? Or is it something else? There are so many discussion points happening today in our conversations with the buy side across industries, wherein these different parameters keep popping up from time to time, and clients are discussing this very keenly. But in the current environment, as we see, and this is the chart that will kind of bring to light what is top of the mind for customers right now, given that we are in an environment wherein recession and slowdown are two aspects that are getting discussed quite a lot. There is increased scrutiny on budgets in terms of spending on technology and operations. And naturally, if you look at the preferences that have been called out, or rather the challenges that have been called out by enterprises, cost or cost pressure or price happens to be right at the very top. And if you just see how the rank order has changed over the years, cost was always one of the top three, but in many ways it has trumped everything else, something like talent or skills shortage, which was number one in 2022, to come right at the top in this environment. But going back to my original point as regards what's really the understanding of value within enterprises, and that's where I'll kind of defer to my colleagues, Mukesh and Zach, also to chime in. 67% of enterprises, if you see the ticker at the bottom of the slide, believe that they are not able to realize the expected value from cloud. And that's the big, huge debate right now. Mukesh, Zach, I don't know if you have any other parameters to add to it before we dive into the meat of the discussion.
I think, we'll be seeing certain examples, right? And we'll be validating it through what we're hearing in the market. The next slide.
Oh, no, absolutely. So one of the things that we need to understand here is that when we look at outsourcing spend itself, and this chart brings to light in terms of the financial tracking that we do in terms of outsourcing spend on technology related services that is happening across the industries. So look at the major players out there in the market. The amount of growth that they have seen in the past seems to be significantly slowing down. Now, there is a distinction between a recession and a slowdown. What this chart shows is that it is a slowdown indeed, whereas a recession would mean that there is degrowth happening, and at least we are not in that space yet. Hence, it's still a growing market in terms of technology spending by enterprises, where they are closely scrutinizing it, but still going ahead and spending it on high value items of spend. So that's that. And that's not just with the sample set that we have included. If we take a flip to the industries, different industries and how they're thinking about it, the story is pretty much similar. Yeah, there is a pecking order here in terms of which are the industries which are spending more, like energy and utilities versus banking and financial services at two ends of the spectrum. But net of it is that the growth of spend on technology services is going down. So coming back to that question of, hey, what is really driving this value-based thought process in terms of where spend will go? I think this is the chart that brings out some snippets from our conversations in the market, where clients have clearly called it out in terms of where and how they are trying to evaluate the spend. Mukesh, do you want to qualify some of these?
Yeah. So, I think these are just some examples that we put out there. But in fact, if we were to just pick up the common theme across almost all conversations that we are having in this space right now, everything is centered around value. People might not be calling it as value. Maybe someone is referring to as cost and, streamlining our entire environment, optimization, modernization. But, everything is centered around maximizing the value that they are getting out of their investments. Now, was it not happening in the past? No, it was always there, right? But I think now, 2023, given the overall macroeconomic environment, given the kind of investments enterprises have already made in the last few years in cloud, now the question has become a lot more pertinent. And it's coming up in almost every boardroom meeting, every conversation with any external consultant, right? Or any large engagement that people are thinking about, right? What's the value that we are getting in? So these are certain examples, right? Where people have called out that they are not able to realize value because sometimes they're not planned upfront. They're looking to optimize their cost management, cloud governance, optimize their AWS spend. I think this is one of the hottest topics right now, and everyone is talking about it, right? In fact, AWS themselves are helping their customers optimize spend on their cloud platforms, right? Because they realize if they don't do it, someone else will. Therefore, that's another topic. Optimization in terms of long-term customer loyalty, right? So again, tying back to value from a very different angle, from an enterprise consumption lens angle, extracting business value from cloud, and finally, how are we tracking the progress that we have made in terms of what investments we are doing, right? So all of these conversations, again, if we were to summarize it, right, everyone is emphasizing it, be the supply side, demand side, the hyperscalers, any tech vendors, everyone is talking about value right now.
Absolutely.
And
in many
with,
ways,
yeah,
go ahead.
Go on.
No, in many ways, seems like the economic side of cloud is kind of becoming the central pivot around which these value discussions are taking place in the current environment. So whether it's around cost containment, whether it's governing different aspects of spend on cloud, how they work with different cloud vendors and their SIs to kind of orchestrate it, seems to be creeping across even elements which might be qualitative in nature, like, hey, how do you define experience and governance aspect of cloud? I think that's becoming a prominent area of spend.
Yeah. And with that, let us quickly take a poll on this particular topic, right? And if we can open the poll and see how important are value conversations in the current macroeconomic environment, and you can think about your enterprise environment right now in terms of how you are dealing with some of this, what kind of conversations you are having. Is it extremely important, somewhat important, not important? Or the last option is also very interesting in terms of I'm not really sure what value conversations are, because we also hear this from a lot of clients in terms of lack of clarity around what's the value that you are getting.
Yeah.
Right, Abhishek, are you also kind of hearing this confusion in terms of what value is?
Same thing. I think the question is less about, hey, in how many situations we are witnessing these value conversations pop up. It's more about what is the relevant importance of the individual value aspects that we keep seeing pop up. I know this question in many ways kind of gives us an understanding of whether or not these important conversations are actually happening, which as I'm seeing the results come up. Oh, interesting. Yeah, in fact, most people find that these are extremely and somewhat important. In fact, there are a few folks who have mentioned that they are not sure what value conversations are. And I think that's maybe a pertinent point to talk about in the next section that's just coming up, in terms of how clients themselves perceive these value leakages. or what they perceived as value, but are not actually realizing results on it, I think would be a good way to kind of answer that section of the audience, which kind of was not sure about the value conversations.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, while that is one section, even people are saying it's very important, right? I think, it's again different definitions. And what we'll try and do is we'll try and align to a common definition of value today, and we'll see towards the end, if we are able to achieve it. But if we just move on, right, and see around growing value leakages, right? So what do we mean by value leakages is that across the enterprise journey, right? Right from when people start to conceptualize cloud to the consulting phase, right, where you're trying to understand which workload should go to which cloud, public cloud, private cloud, within public cloud, AWS, Azure, GCP, the design and build phase, and then the run phase as well, right? And the cycle keeps on going on because there are, an enterprise keeps evolving. So across this entire cycle, what we observe is that people do not realize the expected value because there are multiple value leakage points across the journey. And we tried to synthesize it after interacting with multiple enterprises, multiple supply side providers. What we found out was that essentially these 5 value leakage elements were coming out as most prominent. And what these are, first one in terms of unreasonable or incorrect end state expectations. The second one, inefficient sourcing decision and suboptimal contracting during the cloud adoption phase. Then a lack of expertise to manage cloud environments effectively, struggling with the complexity of cloud infrastructure, and lacking a vertical orientation to the overall cloud strategy. And I went through this a bit quicker because I want to focus on the next slide, where what we've highlighted is indicators that you can use to see whether this is happening in your organization, and this makes it a lot more practical for you to understand how these value leakage elements are actually playing out, right? For example, if you're talking about an incorrect end state expectation, are you suffering from this value leakage? You can understand this if you are facing indicators on the right hand side. For example, you're not able to scale, so cloud strategy is lacking scalability, or there are gaps in compliance due to inconsistent adoption, or there is disagreement among the stakeholders, right? Different CXOs, different business units not aligned on a common definition of value. So that is because you do not have a right end state expectation, a well-defined end state expectation. Similarly, if you look at some of the other indicators on the slide, right? For example, if you see unexplainable inflation in cloud costs, which is very common across a lot of enterprises, inability to switch your vendors and technology inoperability, or underutilization of licenses subscription. This essentially ties back to inefficient sourcing decision and suboptimal contracting during cloud adoption. And all of the other ones are again very self-explanatory. You can go through the indicators and then tie back to where you are seeing this value leakage within your enterprise. Zach, anything specific you would like to also highlight on this slide before we try and understand how we can minimize these?
Not to over-explain, it is more like, on the right, you are seeing some symptoms. And if you're seeing these symptoms in your enterprise or in your day-to-day work, then most probably you are having some value leakage in your environment. So that is how you look at it. I mean, it's sort of a slide which helps you self-analyze and diagnose what is happening within your environment. So that might be a way to look at it.
Yeah. And why don't we also take another poll on this one and see how our audiences here today are able to relate to some of it, right? So in your opinion, which of these following challenges impact the realization of value most? And you can select more than one option for this particular poll.
Yeah. In fact, while people are entering their responses, I think one of the things, especially on the last point, which is around cloud strategy lacking vertical orientation, is that a lot of enterprises, specifically in major industries, are also witnessing, in many ways, a bloat of point solutions within their environment as they try to solve for industry-specific use cases. So whether it's life sciences focusing on clinical trials, whether it's smart manufacturing across a slew of industries, whether it is automobiles and others, and energy and utilities have their own use cases. And the ability of the opportunity that exists with cloud, how it gets applied within these environments is also one of the challenges. And that's where the value realization question becomes also very industry context oriented. That's what also is needed. It's interesting how the results are popping up. I think we'll close this in a few seconds, but there's a kind of a varied set of results that are coming up, which is very interesting to see. I think what takes the cake here is in terms of the lack of expertise to manage cloud environment. And Mukesh and Zach, I'm pretty sure you're smiling at it, because in the last year when we had run this same enterprise key issues survey, talent was at the top of how clients were realizing where they were not actually able to achieve value. And in many ways, it seems like it's still one of the most important things alongside the complexity of cloud infrastructure. I don't know if any quick comments do you want to add before we move to
But complexity, I would correlate to the maturity, development of maturity within enterprises. As more and more cloud is being adopted, it is becoming much more complex to manage multiple cloud, hybrid cloud, whatever you want to call that. I mean, it's just keep on adding elements of cloud. It was easier at first, right now, and now most of them have no visibility of what is happening at one corner to a different corner altogether. So that's a journey, or the adoption journey that also, while you mature in that complexity graph should be growing up. So that's that resonates well as well.
Yep. So now that we have admired the problem for a while, let's move to the solution aspect. And I think that's where we'll try and solve for some of the issues that we have discussed in the last 15 minutes or so. So Mukesh, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Abhishek. So this is where, this is the interesting stuff today, right? In terms of what is the practical way to maximize value within an enterprise. And, when we started and when we were thinking about doing this webinar, right, this was a very hot topic. Everyone started talking about it, but there was no clarity. And now we see that that has become even a bigger problem right now, because people have brought in so many different point of views, but not a lot of it is really practical or implementable within the enterprise. And therefore, we try to create some very on-ground implications, on-ground approaches to see and how we can maximize the value for enterprises. If you move on.
I think I ended up skipping one slide too many.
Yeah, so these are the 5 steps. Abhishek, do you want to kind of lay it out, and then probably I'll take over?
Absolutely. I mean, looking at it, it's pretty intuitive to understand how organizations should go about looking at each of these aspects of designing or approaching value maximization. And it's a 5-step process in many ways. First is the step around definition. I mean, how do we define value? Because as we were discussing a lot of tenets around value realization, what I think is coming to bear is the fact that unless and until you are able to measure something, you will not be able to achieve results on it. So quantification and identification of metrics which you can truly measure is a very important step. Obviously, cost is one of the things that you can measure very easily, but there are aspects related to experience. There are aspects related to productivity, governance, etc., wherein the metrics can be defined to actually realize and measure value. The second step is then planning towards it, because once you define those metrics and you define a moonshot, how do you kind of define a roadmap to achieve or put in the baby steps that will help you achieve the goals become important. And then the question comes around, hey, all right, okay, we have a plan, we have the baby steps, now we start executing. These are the first 3 steps, which in many ways are the setup of the value maximization process. It's when we move to step number 4 and 5, when we start tracking it, measuring it, seeing the results, that's when we start fine-tuning it or refining it in many ways. It's in many ways a virtuous circle of value maximization that we want to set up. And that's what we will go into one by one as we go into the discussions, as we follow through in here.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks Abhishek for setting it up, right? And again, I just want to reiterate that while it looks very simple and intuitive, as we'll peel the layers within it, right? So even defining or planning, right? It's not as simple as it looks in this framework, but let's just try and kind of decode some of it in the next few slides. Okay, so starting with defining the problem, right? Essentially, what is value? So we also were trying to allude to this earlier in terms of that there is no common definition of value for enterprises, and that is actually true, right? So essentially, the value definition needs to be very contextual to your particular environment, and that will be determined by multiple factors. Now, if you move on and see, right? So essentially the approach to defining value now, this can be a three-step process, right? Again, we're oversimplifying it a bit, but still, right, kind to bring out the main pointers. The first one is to understand the prevalent enterprise and market considerations, right? So essentially what's happening within your enterprise. So that's looking inside in your enterprise in terms of the challenges, in terms of your goals, objectives, and also marrying it with the market conditions or the overall macroeconomic factors. For example, now there's a lot of pressure in terms of there's a lot of uncertainty right now, right? So therefore, you might want to reduce on some of the innovations which were more focused from a long-term perspective, right? So that could be one implication of it. The second step to this defining value is deciding on the relevant category of value metric, right? And we'll be seeing some of it below. And the third one is assigning weightages for the identified value metrics. Now, deep diving into the first step in terms of gauging the prevalent enterprise market considerations. Now, some of the factors that are driving this, right? So I talked about looking inwards or inside. So the first step is existing industry or domain of operations. So every industry kind of today in terms of the value definement for a market manufacturing enterprises versus retail enterprises, there will be completely different metrics. What is the type of business or operations you are in? What's your current level of overall adoption in terms of cloud? Are you at the beginning stages, or are you have you adopted cloud for a significant amount of time now? What's the prevalent macroeconomic considerations, the evolving business priorities, and the changing technology landscape? Again, this is not exhaustive, but this is the directional input in terms of how you can decide the metrics in terms of defining value for yourselves. And what we've identified is, if you look in the right-hand side bottom, is these are the 8 elements across which value can be defined very well, right? So agility, cost, compliance, experience, innovation, reliability, security, and sustainability. So some of these are elements which can be measured very easily. For example, cost, which Abhishek was mentioning earlier, right? But what about things such as experience, innovation, right? Reliability. All of these are intangible factors which are not very easy to measure. However, there are ways we can do it, right? In terms of defining sub parameters within all of these elements, we can do it. And we had touched upon this in a lot of detail when we did the last webinar on this topic last year. So we'll not be going into a lot of depth there, but we'll be covering some other important elements today. And the final step in this is assigning value weightages to all of these 8 parameters that we have listed out there. And let's see one example on the next slide. Yeah. So now, I think this is something that we have tried to create in terms of the current environment, right? And we try to work with a few enterprises in terms of what's the value that they are looking for and how they are defining value. So in the current macroeconomic environment, what we are seeing is that the market scenarios include things such as increasing budgetary constraints, lack of consumption and adoption visibility, inefficient cost governance guardrails, right? And I think some of these are topics on which we can speak for quite a length. For example, in terms of cloud consumption, many enterprises have signed up significant consumption with hyperscalers, but they've only consumed 10% or 15% of what they have signed up for right now. That's a big challenge within enterprise in terms of how do they think ahead when they're not even being able to consume what they have already committed to. Then we are also seeing growing complexity of multi and hybrid cloud environments, sprawl from adoption of containers and serverless and other newer technologies, and then cultural differences emerging out of traditional IT and cloud environments. And what all of this is leading to is that in the current environment, we are seeing cost and agility being the 2 main metrics which are seeing highest weightages when value is being defined. For example, cost is, and we took average of, defined when we are trying to define for different enterprises in different verticals. And the average kind of 60% of the weightage today for value is around cost, right? And similarly 15% is coming out to be around agility. And this can vary from enterprise to enterprise, but this is how you can try and go about defining defining value for yourself. Now we'll move on to the step 2, right, which is more around planning. And Zach, would you like to kind of walk the audience today in terms of how they can go about planning it?
Yeah. Thanks, Mukesh. Let me take that up. So the second critical step would be about planning. It is essentially about how do you embed value metrics into your whatever roadmap that you have for your cloud adoption. So while designing cloud maximization strategy, it is more about clearly identifying what are the goals that you are targeting. So in terms of creating relevant and value-centric goals while having milestones in your roadmap of adoption and making it achievable, measurable, and time-bound. That's the first step. But as we had conversation earlier as well, each of the stakeholder will have different definition of value, and aligning that would be important. Say, for example, right now, CFO would be a predominant power in the landscape, enterprise landscape, and that person would be taking decision. For him, cost savings would be, or capital preservation would be the target right now. Someone like a CTO would, or a CIO would think about better scalability. A chief risk officer would be thinking about risk mitigation. So all these are expectations out of cloud. How do you align that stakeholder expectations will be a key in understanding how do you set up, or embed value metrics. And once you have done that, 2 critical steps within this, then it is about identifying key KPIs and OKRs. How do you identify performance indicators that are dynamic, quantifiable, outcome oriented in a direction in which you want to, you want your cloud adoption to be moving. All this ties back to the first step wherein you are defining the value, where value, as Mukesh pointed out, is a combination of tangible and intangible combination. And how do you convert that value definition into key, KPI, whether it is KPIs or OKRs, whatever works for you within your premise of services or products. That is something that you have to align for while, definitely while creating milestones and aligning your stakeholder expectations with it. Again, to make it much more clear in the next slide, what we have tried to do is pick up an representative scenario once again. So to make it much more clear. So on the left, you can see different key stakeholders that would be that would be there in your landscape. So when it comes to CIO, it might be, or a CTO, it might be about compliance, reliability, and innovation, while CEO, she would be thinking about cost, agility, experience. So while the CFO is more about cost and compliance, the chief security officer will be about reliability, security, and compliance. So these are the different stakeholders that you have and different stakeholder expectations that you need to match. Once you identify what are the important things, say, for example, going ahead with a similar experience or similar scenario that we taken in the last while defining the value. So cost and agility, which has a weightage of around 60% and 15% as we had defined. Depending on the existing enterprise scenario, macroeconomic conditions, what we are aiming for. Within cost, see how we can divide that into different elements of people, process, and technology to get into minute parameters within that and assign weights within that. And similarly, within agility, what do you mean by agility? What are the parameters that you want to track as a part of KPIs and OKRs? That is about setting up this second step of planning and embedding value metrics into your cloud adoption roadmap. Moving on to the next step, which is more about executing. So we have defined it. We have defined it. So we have defined it, and we talked about planning and embedding value metrics into that. Now we are talking about execution. So while we are talking about execution, it is not that you execute cloud value oriented initiatives separately or in a silos or in a single adoption while separating out the larger mainstream cloud adoption. We are talking about merging these two these two things together in first step 1 and 2. So when we talk about cloud adoption journey, you might be talking about cloud lifecycle from, say, for example, assessment, build design, manage, running it, things like that. There will be different elements of cloud life journey that you might be concerned about at this moment. But be whatever part of the journey you are, we are able to break that into three different definite parameter, three definite elements, which is people, process, and technology. So consider adopting value-centric initiatives across each of these categories, be it people, be it process and technology, so that it defines and aligns with what you are defined as value, cloud value that you need from the cloud adoption. So for example, when you talk about people, think about what your change management strategies would be. How do you ensure knowledge management and embed a culture of cloud, which is different from erstwhile IT environment. When you think about technology, for example, think about industry specific solutions. How do you leverage automation, cloud management tools that would enable the cloud business orientation as well as cloud orientation of that fact. Moving ahead, so the fourth step would be, sorry, there seems to be.
And while we while we get back, probably Zach, one question from the audience that we had, and we can maybe address it as a part of the last slide, and I'll just read it out for you. How does value proposition of cloud align with different phases of cloud journey, planning, design, build, migration, test, monitor, and optimize? Which phases should the top value gains be targeted and planned for? Now, I just want you to kind of correlate this with people, process, and technology, right? Because this is taking a different lens in terms of, the entire journey, more from a provider lens, I would say, right? Planning, design, build, test, monitor. These are terms that, you use when you are actually doing the execution and during the journey. So how does that correlate?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, actually. So when you think about cloud life journey, it would start at planning, then it would then it would have a design build element, then it would have, implementation, and then it would have a run element around it. All of these elements, I feel, can be broken down into three main categories around people, process, and technology. Wherever you feel, say, for example, during assessment or during planning, that is where, strategizing for your change management becomes important. Say, for example, in a build scenario, what is your scenario? What is your strategy when it comes to platform versus product approach, or whether it is a service oriented approach? Who is building it? Picking up the right partners who can help revamp the existing processes and bring help you realize value realization in an accelerated manner. That will be important. So I think all the life elements that you talk about, you can actually think about it in these three elements and try to build and ask yourself questions whether you are centering your approach in based on the definition that you had and the plan that you had built in terms of metrics. I think most important of that would be the next stage, which is about tracking. I think where Mukesh, you will be able to explain in a better way how all this comes together.
Sure. So I think before we move on to the next step, Abhishek, I think if we just go back to how you had set it up, right, and talking about the first three steps as more of a setup of how you try and really set it up for realizing value within enterprises. Trick or a difficult question for you is, do you see certain challenges in this, right? Because we have laid it out in terms of how you can go about this, but do you see certain challenges or pitfalls that enterprises really need to avoid in these steps till now?
Yeah, a very interesting question, because in most conversations, it's not that organizations are not already doing it. And I'm pretty sure if everybody in the audience was on video, when I was running through those 5 steps, I would have seen a few frowns. Hey, we are already doing this, and why are you asking us to kind of do this? It's not like it's something new. I think the pitfalls here are in the aspects related to the way Zach was describing it from the perspective of people, process, and technology, and also the measurement aspect of the individual metrics. Because a lot of times what we kind of sign out to measure may not have the buy-in from the key power users within the organizations, whether these are the application owners who are concerned about risk, governance, privacy, and other issues, because a lot of these cloud initiatives are run top down. And I'm talking from experience in a couple of client examples wherein this has actually happened. Now, these are real issues. And that's why theoretically, these three aspects make sense. Touching upon and going into the details of whether you are taking the buy-in of power users from a people perspective, from a process perspective, are you actually looking at transforming the process or just applying band-aids to it? That's a very important aspect, because when you are using technology, which is the third element, as a bedrock of people and process and trying to transform something, it is very, very important to take those two aspects along. And that is why when we use the word transformation, we need to take it very seriously. It's not fixing minor issues that are popping up from here and there. It is not just a set of watermelons in a water body that you are trying to push down. And obviously, when that happens, you'll see something else pop up. So that's where the question comes up. So all of these aspects are important. Measurement is important. Seeking buy-in is important. And that transformation mindset of looking at it not from just from the perspective of it being a band-aid to the issues, but overall improvement in the processes that we are talking about.
Yeah. No, I thank you for that. And that sets it up very nicely for the next section and talking about, right? Because this is about really a lot of introspection, about going back and checking whether you're doing what you had committed to in the beginning of the cloud journey. And that is something which I think, is applicable to almost all of us in multiple aspects, right? But when you're talking about cloud transformation, I think it's really very relevant. And it's about tracking, right? So you have now defined and you have also executed a plan, you have planned and you are now in the execution phase. But are you doing what you had committed for, or are other factors, or other macroeconomic or other internal tussles within the organization, they are taking over, and now you're moving in a completely different direction. So that is about tracking and monitoring the value realized across different sets of KPIs and OKRs. Now, essentially what we are talking about is that there needs to be continuous monitoring and governance. That is how you can track value effectively. And again, in terms of defining, how you're going to do this, that will vary across most enterprise. Basically, it will be very contextual to enterprise. But still, if we are thinking about and talking about at a slightly high level in terms of what can be done. So one is the monitoring aspect of it. Right now, there are two major things that come within monitoring. One is having that real-time view. So you need to create a real-time dashboard to continuously observe the key metrics. This can be done in various ways, right? There are tools available out there. You can also use hyperscalers or other partners to do some of it. And again, the second point is around that in terms of selecting the right tools and technologies that effectively collect the data for the predefined KPIs or OKRs. Now, again, just a minor, just want to highlight this right now. KPI is something which is very commonly understood and is seen across most enterprises. OKRs essentially are objectives and key results. And what we have been stressing upon is defining those objectives, and are you getting results in line with those objectives? And sometimes KPIs as the metric, the way they are defined, do not align to that and do not give that insight. And therefore, we are also stressing upon OKRs as something that you should be measuring. Then we are also talking about governance, where essentially, again, two main steps are establishing accountability and leveraging management by objectives framework to achieve the established goals. And second one is setting a threshold for effective governance of key KPIs and OKRs, because often we see that the goalpost keeps moving, and that is not something you want to do if you are really committed towards a particular initiative or a particular direction. I think we again facing some challenges with the slides. Yeah. If we go back one slide. So now when we're talking about what are the considerations for value measurement, so we talked about in terms of monitoring and governance, these are the things that you need to look at. But there are a few other things that you need to consider, and these are the essential high-level parameters, right? So one is in terms of data quality and availability. Now there is a lot of data available within enterprises, and it becomes so huge that it becomes very difficult to analyze it, right? So therefore, getting to the right data quality and the entire conversation around AI and generative AI right now happening ties back to this point. Then existing environment variabilities is something you need to consider, and investments in tools and technologies, we briefly touched upon. This is something that you again need to consider while tracking in the tracking phase. And finally, as we try and come to the fifth point, which is around refinement, and that is where we'll see that this is not a one and done process, right? Essentially, this needs to be done over and over again. And Zach, do you want to kind of take this up? Okay.
Sorry, I wasn't mute. I think maybe you can take this up.
Sure. So in terms of refinement, right, again, just continuing the chain of thought, basically what you're saying is that we need to continuously improve the value realized by setting benchmarks and redefining value. So as you were saying, there is not one consistent definition of value for different enterprises, and even for the same enterprise, it needs to keep evolving over a period of time. And if we see the steps involved in this, yeah, so essentially, the steps involved are three-step process, right? First is establishing a baseline. So here, what enterprises really need to do is that you set a baseline in terms of what's your current state and what is the ideal state that you are looking at, and track the process of the value generated in line with it. Then you benchmark the impact, right? That will be the second step, whether you are getting the actual returns on the cloud investments that you have made, right, against the identified benchmarks. This you can do. The benchmarking exercise can be done by seeing enterprises which are of similar cloud maturity, which are in similar industry or geography, under similar kind of business or operations. And there you can also kind of see the range in terms of what's best in class versus what's a typical enterprise is doing, and where you stand when you compare yourself to that. And the third step is redefining value, right? So as we mentioned, right, you need to do it iteratively. Every 6 months, every 8 months, right, you need to take a step back and see whether what value you had realized, the metrics that you had defined, whether those still make sense or not. For example, if suddenly we see a drastic change in the overall macroeconomic environment right now, you might start to just shift your weightages on cost, what you had in cost, to innovation as quickly as possible, right? So there you need to keep redefining value. If you want a detailed session in terms of how to build a detailed value maximization strategy, right, we'd be really happy to do that. We would really go about and try and understand your particular environment in more detail, and then contextualize this entire framework to you, and then we can share it with you. Okay. Now, a quick recap of the 5-step approach to value maximization, right? So step 1 to step 5. Yeah. So yeah, I think as Abhishek mentioned, right, we strongly recommend to take this offer up because, there's a lot about contextualizing this framework. It's a good starting point, but it really varies from enterprise to enterprise. So just doing a quick recap, step 1 was defining, right, gauging the prevalent enterprise consideration, the market considerations. Based on that, you decide on the relevant categories of value metrics, assign weightages for the identified value metrics. We saw that some of these factors are tangible, some of these factors are intangible in nature. How do you go about quantifying those intangible factors as well? All of that is step 1, which is defining value. Step 2 is planning, which is setting definite goals, aligning stakeholder expectations, and identifying the key KPIs or OKRs. Step 3 was about execution, and we saw it from 2 lenses. One was people, process, and technology, and another was through the entire step process of the life cycle, right? How do you, from say consulting, design, build, the run phase, all of these phases, how do you execute value and how do you embed value in all of these phases was step 3. Step 4 was tracking, which was around continuous monitoring with the right tools and technologies, and establishing a governance mechanism to achieve value tracking objectives. And finally, step 5 was relooking at every few months or at an interval of time defined by you in terms of whether you are achieving what you had set out to achieve, right? Whether you are assessing and benchmarking the impact, and then you need to really redefine value according to that, and you go back to step 1 and start again, right? Now, how can we ensure success? We really need to ask some tough questions. Zach, do you want to talk about what these tough questions could be that enterprises need to ask themselves?
Yeah, so essentially, I mean, it's again an illustrative list, right? So we had a conversation about the challenges that you face. Are you able to align every stakeholder to one value definition? I mean, that would be the biggest challenge and the question that you have to ask yourself. Can you pinpoint, what are the value impacting factors? It is not just cost. That is what, if you take something away from this webinar, that would be one message, value is not equal to cost. There are more things than cost. Are you able to identify those metrics as well? And are you able to bring that together into one single value definition? And then about tracking and refining, that constant circle, which is a circle of able to track it, govern it, and able to redefine your value, which is again a maturity that you have to reach or aspire for, but you have to set your path, your North Star towards that direction. So these are few questions that you might want to ask yourself while setting off on such a particular journey, or are you exploring something in a value-centric conversation? Then these might be the questions that might help you trigger some thought-provoking answers that can come out of it.
Truly. And it's easier said than done. And I know all of us would agree on that. All right. So I think let's move on and just take a quick recap from the audience itself in terms of, now that we have wrapped up these 5 aspects of how you look at value realization and how you follow through on it, which are the ones which you see as being most challenging to follow through on, wherein you feel you will need most help? And in many ways, that's where the research that we do can come in some sort of help in helping you do that, because we have seen many scenarios, we have seen the level of refinements that certain organizations have gone through versus others. So there are good number of benchmarks that are available for organizations to follow through on. Yeah, it's easy to say that something is best in class, but when you look at a sample set, you are able to create a spectrum of where you see things working better versus where things are just starting off. And that's where our research comes handy. And as I'm seeing the results come up and the responses kind of come through, it's interesting how it kind of distributes really well across the top 3, because that's the setup aspect. And that's it's not surprising at all for me that define, design, and execute is where most of you folks see the challenges. And yep, and this is when we share results.
Abhishek, if I have to put you on spot, which one will you pick?
I think step 1 is always the most challenging in any process, and that's where the definition aspect of it, because as I was talking about it being a virtuous cycle, once you define it well, following through on the other steps becomes easy. Not that other steps are easier by any stretch of imagination, but pinning down the base parameters on which value realization needs to happen. And to your point, Zach, like cost is not the only point of measurement. There are other parameters that need to be prioritized. What those are, how they are to be measured, and that people process technology question of whose buy-in you would need, and what kind of process transformation would you need to do in order to achieve value realization, all become very important that way. Did I answer your question?
I think, yeah, it kind of, but I have a different opinion altogether. So I feel the industry is right now in the first 3 stage. I mean, like, they have not yet defined what value is. Leave the tracking and redefining part. I mean, that I feel the most important problem right now is defining and designing it. and then obviously execute. And I think that it is more about the maturity and the problem that they're facing right now.
Yeah, and that is why, I mean, this is again another offer for the audience here in case you want to dig into the digital possibilities for your business, teams, and IT organization, benchmark your existing practices, or even from a sourcing perspective, who do you work with and how they can add to your value realization journey. If you need a session on that, we are very happy to offer you that, because what we are able to cover in the last, we were able to cover in the last 45 to 50 minutes is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the value realization journey. So if any of you feel that digging deeper into any of those aspects will be of help to you, feel free to sign up for it, which through using the link that has been provided on the chat. All right. On that note, I also wanted to call out the fact that we do a good bit of research around the sourcing aspect related to cloud when it comes to the vendors who operate in the different cloud ecosystems. I know some or most of you probably have already seen this research, but I just wanted to put that out in case that also is an aspect of value realization for you. There is a lot of insight that you can gather from that. And obviously, you can bake that into the questions that you want to ask us, either as part of this webinar or as part of the follow-throughs that we have provided you a link for. Mukesh, do you want to, should we take up questions, or do we have any more slides left?
No, we can take up Q&A. I think that's, and we are good with time. So we have good 5-7 minutes to answer some of the questions that we have received today. And for others, if you have any question, right, you can just type in your questions in the dialog box and type send. For if you want to reach out to us later, you have the email ID contacts of the 3 presenters today. Just feel free to reach out to any one of us for a complimentary assessment of your organizational digital effectiveness, or in case you have any questions about the presentation we had today. Right. So meanwhile, we can start with some of the Q&A. Right. I see one in the panel popping up right now. One, it was around, is it monitoring or observability? I think I can take it up. Basically, yes, you're right. It's a combination of both monitoring and observability. Observability is the broader umbrella within an enterprise, and that's where you have a lot of tools coming up for that also. So it's essentially, it gets consumed within the monitoring and governance or the tracking part of it that we were talking about. Okay. There are a few more questions, and maybe the next one I'll pose it to Zach. One question we have from the audience is that, do you expect the reverse migration of enterprises from public cloud back to private cloud becoming significant over the next 18 months? I think this is an interesting question, especially in the context of value that we have been talking about today, right? Is public cloud the right option, and will we see a lot of repatriation, right? If we talk technically, what's your view on it, Zach?
Yeah, very interesting question. We have come across very public examples of few enterprises who have gone back from public cloud to private cloud, where they find it more convenient or more more value-centric to host their workloads in a private cloud rather than public cloud. That conversation will keep happening, but I feel the most important thing right now the enterprises are going through, and I suggest that they should be evaluating, is about placing their workloads in the right environment. So it is not whether it is public or private or maybe edge or whatnot. It is more about what does your business need and what is your specific use case that you're catering to and trying to place that. Obviously, an element of correction is happening in the market in terms of placement strategies has been kind of being revamped and relooked into, and as a part of that, a small amount of workload movement is expected, but again, the gravity of the workloads is still largely in on-premise or private. Public cloud, even though hasn't a lot of workloads, it's not the biggest gravity that we feel, and a lot more has to be there. And I guess the future hosting options, that is where it will get affected. And that's a good thing for the industry as a whole, re-looking into what works for you and what works from an industry, business, and use case perspective, and trying to identify that. And obviously there are multiple use cases which will work better in a private cloud vis-a-vis public cloud, and there are other options as well, vice versa as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'll take up one more question and that I can do. So how do cloud native solutions and application modernization factor into the value conversation? Again, good question, right? The way I see it is these are enablers of value realization for enterprises, right? Essentially, if we talk about the 5 steps, some of this will fit best into the execute part of it, where you are bringing cloud native solutions, you are modernizing your overall applications to ensure that it's most aligned to what you have defined, right? In terms of whether you are looking for cost benefits or looking for agility and so on. That's how you go about defining it. And all of these, both of these, right, the way I see it, these are enablers of value realization. Jack, anything to add on in that from a cloud native and app mod perspective?
So that is where the value definition becomes important, isn't it, Mukesh? I mean, if it is only about cost, then sometimes modernization might not be the right choice. Breaking it into microservices might not be the right choices if it is only about cost. That's where the value definition becomes important. As you rightfully said, whether it's agility, innovation, those elements, how do you measure that into the value and how do you make business case for it? That becomes much more important in these conversations. Then only you can justify sometimes moving to something else.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just quickly squeeze in one more question, and before we wrap up today, is in terms of what's the right balance between too many cloud platforms versus few. And I think the way I interpret this question is we are talking about hyperscalers here, right? In terms of whether you have AWS, Azure, GCP, multiple private cloud vendors, and so on. And I don't think there is a really straightforward answer to this. But what we have observed is if you're talking about public cloud platform, generally a combination of 2 is seen to be working well. And it ties back to the entire complexity that tends to happen when you are adopting too many cloud environments and different platform and technology vendors. But again, it really depends, right? That's no direct answer to this one. Okay, so I think we can take a few more questions offline. We'll respond to those, but we are at the top of the time for today. I quickly wanted to scroll through the concluding slides for today. So we have a lot of blogs that we publish as part of our cloud and infrastructure services research. These are a few of those, but you can visit the website mentioned over here to see a plethora of other blogs that we have talked about, right, and on a lot of recent topics. And also, if you go to our website, you'll be able to see a lot of related content, which is around cloud services that we have been publishing over the last few years. And again, a lot of it will be very relevant in the current environment. And there's some of the questions that you have been asking will also get answered by some of these related content. So as you mentioned, right, happy to interact in terms of, if you want to understand your maturity and how you can apply this value framework to your enterprise, or do you have any specific questions, please feel free to reach out to any of the presenters today. The email ID is mentioned in the slide deck. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. Hope you found value from this particular presentation we did today. And yeah, thank you and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.